Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our first hybrid meeting of the Graduate and Faculty Christian Forum. So we welcome you, whether you're here in this room in the Jack Bell Building, School of Social Work at UBC, or at home online. And we want to begin by acknowledging our presence here on the traditional and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. We acknowledge that. The Graduate and Faculty Christian Forum, as some of you will know, has been going for a long time, since the late 1980s. And I believe this is the last meeting of the term. We meet approximately monthly during the teaching year to discuss issues on the relationship between faith and science and society. And today, it's my very great pleasure to introduce Matthew Lynch, Associate Professor of Old Testament at Regent College. Matt has a master's, actually two master's degrees, right, from Regent, then a PhD from Emory University, and postdoctoral work at Göttingen in Germany. Matt stayed in Europe for a while after that year, for 7 years, in fact, in the UK, before joining Regent in 2020. As I said, Matt teaches Old Testament, and he's authored several books. One, the first Isaiah and the Disappearance of the Gods. Second, Portraying Violence in the Hebrew Bible. A third, Monotheism and Institutions in the Book of Chronicles. And finally, and currently, a book on Blood and Fury, Engaging Old Testament Violence, and that is coming out, or is it out? It's just about to come out.
Yeah, it's out now.
It is now out with InterVarsity Press.
Yeah.
So Matt is highly accomplished, and we're very grateful to hear him speak on The Land Keeps the Score, Violence in Creation, according to the Old Testament.
Okay. Thanks so much for that introduction. It's good to be here with you and with folks online. And I'll be admitting people as they come in. And just for folks online to know that the lights here are flashing on and off for some random reason, but that shouldn't affect the projection. Okay. Standard treatments of biblical ethics tend to address the topic of land in ways that feature creation care or stewardship of the land. These commendable emphases are not surprising, as we tend to treat ethics in terms that feature human agency. Just going to admit 2 more people. And action in the world. What I suggest in this paper, however, is that humans do not only enact their morality in the world, but that the physical world is, at least according to the Bible, fundamentally moral. In short, there is a moral ecology in which humans, along with animals and plants, participate. This moral ecology features prominently in the Old Testament's early chapters, but emerges in other places as well. So you could think, for instance, of sorry at this multitasking. All right, Hosea chapter 4, where it says, "There is no faithfulness or loyalty, and no knowledge of God in the land. Swearing, lying, and murder, and stealing, and adultery break out. Bloodshed follows bloodshed. Therefore, the land mourns, and all who live in it languish. Together with the wild animals and the birds of the air, even the fish of the sea are perishing." In this talk, I'm going to discuss the concept of ecology itself in some places where moral reasoning features prominently. Then I'll address the moral qualities of the land in Genesis 1 through 9, especially chapters 2 to 4 in there, and reflexes of those qualities in the book of Job. That section will feature the role of violence in the human land moral matrix. Okay, so moving on. In his landmark book, The Body Keeps the Score, Bessel van der Kolk discusses the myriad bodily impacts of traumatic experiences. Trauma, both psychological and physical, imprints itself on our bodies. Blood pressure spikes, muscle pain, illness, paralysis, and more can occur alongside the deactivation of rational thinking and even memory. Even where the conscious mind forgets, the body keeps the score. As van der Kolk notes, quote, the trauma that started out there is now played out on the battlefield of our own bodies, usually without a conscious connection between what happened back then and what is going on right now inside. Part of the impact of that trauma on the body is the disintegration of the self. Trauma breaks down the connections that ought to exist within the mind, self, and community. Conversely, healing involves the pursuit of connectedness, whether by retraining neural connections, restoring brain-body harmony, or fostering healthy social attachment and relationships. The pursuit of connectedness in some studies extends beyond the self and even one's community to the physical world as well. Such claims are especially prominent in indigenous approaches to mental health. As Jennifer Matisse Redvers notes in her article, The Land is a Healer, quote, land-based practices centered in indigenous pedagogy recognize that identity is interwoven with and deeply connected to the land. Land-based healing recognizes that the land is an active partner to the person or people engaged in the healing process. The extension of healing connectedness into the realm of ecology isn't surprising. The very notion of connectedness lies at the heart of the ecological endeavor from its inception. I'll mention three figures here briefly to underscore this point, and this is on the topic of ecology. First, Ernst Haeckel. Ernst Haeckel was a German zoologist, naturalist, and artist who first coined the term ecology, German Ökologie. Haeckel was enormously influential in Germany and beyond. As Robert Richert notes in his study on the history of the concept of ecology, quote, prior to the First World War, more people learned of evolutionary theory from the voluminous writings of Charles Darwin's foremost champion in Germany, Ernst Haeckel, than from any other source, including the writings of Darwin himself. Haeckel's influence also extends into the world of art, with this focus on forms in nature. Got some more of his artistic work here. Haeckel developed the word ecology to name the growing interest in the mutually affective relationships between plants and animals. For Haeckel, ecology involved the investigation of the total relations of the animal, both in its inorganic and to its organic environment, including above all its friendly and inimical relations with those animals and plants with which it comes directly or indirectly into contact. Haeckel puts it this way: in a word, ecology is the study of all those complex interrelations referred to by Darwin as the conditions for the struggle of existence. Now, in Haeckel's understanding of nature, moral concerns take a back seat. On the one hand, his work prepared the way for considerations of human impact on climate and ecology in the work of figures like Charles Marsh. But on the other hand, Haeckel apparently embraced social Darwinism with its vision of necessary violent struggle for the emergence of higher life forms, which carried dangerous implications. And there's a debate in ecology about the degree to which Haeckel kind of prepared the ground for particular Nazi forms of social Darwinism. Another figure I want to mention here is Aldo Leopold. None has been more influential in thinking about the moral implications of the concept of ecology than the American naturalist Aldo Leopold. While the word ecology was coined in 1866 by Haeckel, its popularization as a concept occurred in the English-speaking world in the late 50s and 60s, 1950s and 60s. Around this time, ecologists were brought into the cultural mainstream, testifying in Congress on both sides of debates about pesticides following the publication of Rachel Carson's influential book, Silent Spring. In the appendix to his Sand County Almanac, this is from 1949, published just after his death, Leopold published an appendix called The Land Ethic. It's quite short and interesting read, a very influential piece. In it, he discusses the idea of a biotic community in which various obligations exist. The land ethic, Leopold writes, simply enlarges the boundaries of the community to include soil, water, plants, animals, or collectively the land. The obligations between members of this biotic community are mutual because the community is interdependent. Leopold called for an extension of the social conscience from people to the land, as he put it. Participation in the land community, as he dubs it, constitutes the sphere of obligation that extends beyond self-interest. And if you look at contemporary discussions on the ethics of ecology, Leopold's name comes up repeatedly. Another figure I want to mention is contemporary. His third figure is Robin Wall Kimmerer. She is a Potawatomi scientist and author. In many ways, Kimmerer's work echoes Leopold's, though perhaps matters are the other way around in a way. As Paula Gunn Allen notes, Leopold's land ethic is little more than a modern interpretation of traditional people's concept of nature as a community, of which humans are just one member. Kimmerer's work, like other indigenous authors, foregrounds notions like reciprocity and gratitude when speaking about human-land relationships. She also highlights the agency of the plants in relation to human attitudes and practices. In these ways, she goes beyond what we might consider a purely scientific description of human-land interactions. I'll let Bill in. She writes, if we respect a plant and use it well, it will stay with us and flourish. If we disrespect or ignore it, it will go away. For Kimmerer, humans are not just members of a biotic community, they are also critical to its success. Without the human act of harvesting, for instance, plants like sweetgrass, which depend on a disturbance regime stimulated by harvesting, would suffer. She notes that traditional ecological knowledge helps us see the many ways that, quote, harvesting activities are linked to the well-being of the plant population, end quote. She also quotes traditional sayings like, that plant has disappeared because no one picks it anymore, or that tree has gone away because people forget how to use it, or the admonition, we better go out digging or else there won't be any more for our grandchildren. For Kimmerer, science helps us ask yes-no questions, but can't address those right-wrong questions. And toward that end, she notes the need to include categories like traditional ecological knowledge, which in varying ways honors a, quote, spiritual understanding of the ecology. Now, the Bible has much to say on such matters. Biblical writers had opinions. Or perhaps better, I should say that biblical writers had assumptions about the moral nature of the land that emerged periodically, though without overt explanation. You don't argue for something you assume about the world. To that end, this portion of my study attends to ways biblical writers assume that the land is a moral context or moral ecology, and not just the stage on which moral agents act. By moral ecology, I'm referring to, first of all, the ways that reciprocal obligations attend the human-land relationship. And secondly, or I should say B, ways that the land bears the marks of human moral activity, and C, ways that the land acts as a moral agent. That's the one that maybe is most surprising. So this next section will examine the moral ecology of Genesis 2 to 4 before looking at some similar conceptions in the book of Job. I've selected Genesis 2 to 4 and the book of Job. It might seem like strange partners, because of the remarkable parallels between the way these texts speak about the human person and the human's relationship to the land, as well as the land's own agency. The importance of the land-human relationships in the early chapters of Genesis is well known. As some have noted, Job seems to reflect similar ideas and may even be interpreting Genesis. Job also evokes creation themes from the book of Psalms, so it's like it's reading both books, though with some irony, including the psalmist's wonder at God's regard for humans. From Psalm 8, "Let me alone," Job says, "for my days are a breath. What are human beings that you make so much of them?" Which in Psalm 8 is a cause for marvel. That you set your mind on them, visit them every morning, test them every moment. So here Job is reflecting this idea of the Psalms, but it's not a good thing to have God contemplating humans so much. Elsewhere, Bildad evokes Psalm 8 and concludes not that humans are a little less than divine, as Psalm 8:5 says, but that they're little more than maggots. In other words, the character Job emphasizes humanity's earthly origins. Humans are made from dust and clay, and to these they will return. So you can see the connection between the terminology here that suggests that Job is referring back to Psalm 8. Elsewhere, Eliphaz evokes the idea of the life-giving breath of God, in Hebrew, Nishmat Adonai, from Genesis 2:7, but to remind Job of that breath's death-dealing properties. Job 4:9, by the breath of God, Nishmat Elohah, humans perish, and by the blast of his anger, they are consumed. So the breath of God here is not life-giving, but death-dealing. Later in the same passage, Eliphaz reminds Job that God will charge with guilt those who are made from the clay, who are from the dust. So clearly these books are in conversation. Though they take similar land-oriented themes in different directions. And I'm going to look at some of these ways with attention to the ways that each book assumes a similar moral ecology, even if there are different emphases. Let's begin with Genesis 2. The idea that humans share an earthy beginning with the rest of creation is well grounded here. Water springs up from the earth to water the ground. And in Hebrew, the term for the spring is aid, which is linked to the term adamah. So aid, you can hear the A vowel plus the D sound, also in adamah. God made the human, or the Adam, from the ground, or the adamah. Trees are made from the ground. Animals of the field and birds of the air are made from the ground. All min ha-adamah, from the ground. In a similarly evocative way, the woman is made min ha-adam, from the human, or the groundling. As Carol Newsom states, we share common ground with the earth because we are common ground. But when expelled from the garden, the Lord, it says, the Lord God sent him forth from the Garden of Eden to till the ground from which he was taken. This passage shifts our attention from the garden as the object of human service to the ground, to which humans will eventually return. Later, Cain, the ground worker, offers some of the fruit from the ground. Thus far in the story, the ground is the place from which all life springs. The frequent use of the phrase from the ground, Hebrew min ha-adamah, underscores the vitality, but also the participation of animals and plants and humans in the life of the ground. So it's interesting to think about soil as a source of vitality in these texts. As with all creatures, humanity's from the ground origin speaks to its vitality. Yet the phrase el ha'adamah, to the ground, in Genesis 3:19, speaks of another aspect of humanity's soilsome identity. They will ultimately return to the ground. The earthy origins of humanity feature prominently in Job as well. But the book isn't primarily interested in the process of divine formation. Instead, the book focuses on divine deformation. Clay portends its own divine deformation. So Job cries out, "Your hands shaped and made me," but then he quickly pivots. "All at once you turned around and destroyed me. Consider now how you have made me as clay, and to dust you will have me return." Job also refers to humans as those who dwell in houses of clay, whose foundations are in the dust, in Job 4:19. Like pots, humans have their origin in the clay and are shaped from it. But again, Job pivots in Job 4:19. It seems that humans are made from the clay, quote, "that they may be crushed before their maker." Job then reasons that if God charges his angels with error, how much more those made from the ground? Clay creatures can't hold a candle to celestial creatures. The clay and dust reality of human existence speaks of a God who, quote, "crushes humans to pieces, destroying them so that none can even recognize them." In one interesting case, Job displays a rare verbal form of the noun for clay. So in Hebrew, you can take a noun and then derive a verb from it. So the word for clay is homer. And he uses that noun, but he makes a verb out of it creatively to describe the way that grief made his face red like clay. So you have red like clayed my face, essentially, Job is saying. The clay-like face is just perfect for weeping. Job goes on to describe the Salmavet, or the death-like shadow on his eyelids, recalling the land of gloom and deep darkness. Same term used in Psalm 23, the valley of the shadow of death. So the face reflects the ground in its grief and anticipates the underworld on its eyelids. In his final protest, Job laments the fact that God had flung him into the clay. He has become dust and ashes. In fact, it's from the dust and ashes, that Job cries out, evoking the idea of a protest or call for vengeance that we see elsewhere in the book. In these ways, the book of Job aligns with Genesis 3 in reminding us of soil and clay as the destination of humans and not just their origins. In these different ways, Genesis and Job foreground the affinity between humans and the land. A kinship exists between humans and the soil. It's the place from which life springs forth, but soil also provides a way of contemplating the destiny of humans and of God's role in shaping life toward that end, a point that Job doesn't want us to miss. Humans are like pots, special made to be smashed. They're like clay and therefore ideal candidates for trampling. Our clay-like features are no more visible than when we weep. But even more than outlining human origins and plight, the land is a moral reality in Genesis and Job. This becomes no more apparent than when speaking about violence in these books. The creation story in Genesis 2 wants us to think about the problem of violence from its earliest pages. After the first humans eat from the tree, God spells out the consequences of their decision to trust the serpent's voice. "I will put enmity between you and the woman, between her offspring, your offspring, and hers. He will strike at your head, and you will strike at his heel." The rare Hebrew term translated enmity refers to the malice accompanying violent deeds. It appears next in the Bible's homicide laws in the book of Numbers. The presence of enmity is what moves a crime from unintentional to intentional. It's like intent to kill with malice. Each of the 5 uses of the term enmity in the Old Testament are violent in nature. Genesis 3 here in verse 15 describes the serpent and the woman's offspring violently striking each other. Genesis 3:15 is not only about a spiritual conflict between the woman's offspring and enemy evil forces, it depicts real world flesh and blood violence. Moreover, the creational environment of that violence interests our author. Just before stating this enmity, we hear in the previous verse 14, that the serpent is cursed more than, or you could translate it, away from the wild animals and farm animals. So you have this creature that's alienated from other animals And it involves a kind of return to the dust, because God says it will eat of the dust of the ground as it goes about on its belly. And it's from there that violence will now spring forth toward the human. So you now have the ground as a source of violence against the humans. In addition to violence from the dust eater, the ground now puts forth thorns and thistles toward humanity. In Genesis 3:18, it is the ground that takes the initiative here. It, namely the ground, will sprout thorns and thistles for you. This declaration warps the earlier picture of Genesis 2, where Yahweh caused every tree that was pleasing to the sight and good for food to sprout from the ground. In short, Genesis 3 presents violent attacks, thorns and thistles arising from the very ground where humans were supposed to acquire their food and from which they were formed. In this complicated story of humanity's alienation from animals, hostilities emerge. And these themes of land and violence converge almost immediately in Genesis 4, when Cain murders Abel. After killing his brother, Abel, God questions Cain. What have you done? The voice of your brother's shed blood cries out to me from the ground. So now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's shed blood from your hand. Abel's blood has returned to the soil from which he was taken, and from within the mouth that received it, a cry goes forth. It's a very evocative image. As Westermann notes, the ground then appears as a being which, as it were, gulps the blood of the victim down its throat. The opposition arising directly from the ground finds vivid expression in Genesis 4:12a, which says, when you work the ground, it will no longer yield its strength to you. Notice the agency here. Here the ground refuses to produce for Cain, the ground worker. More than the thorns and thistles, which would certainly frustrate farming, the ground now halts the farming endeavor altogether. The ground keeps the score, to evoke van der Kolk's study. The ground carries the wound and memory of violent acts from and against its fellow groundlings. We've observed thus far that Genesis recognizes the complex relationship between humans and the land, and the reality of violence that emerges from and is voiced from the ground. How do these themes feature in the book of Job? Initially, we can note the way that Job's friends respond to Job's lament from the dust. Bildad asks Job, you who tear yourself in your anger, shall the earth be forsaken because of you? Creation is not on Job's side, Bildad reckons. Eliphaz reasons that, quote, misery does not sprout from the earth, nor does trouble sprout from the ground. Rather, misery and evil are cultivated. He says in chapter 4, verse 8, those who plow iniquity and sow trouble reap the same. The ground does not just spontaneously and without reason grow trouble. Instead, it puts forth what humans sow. There's a correlation between the human moral inputs and outputs. As Siao writes, Adamah, namely the ground, is not the source of the problem for Eliphaz. Adam is. True enough, but the ground reveals that human-sourced moral problem. Eliphaz directs Job to God, quote, who gives rain to the earth and sends waters to the fields. The not so subtle implication of his advice is that if Job would turn toward God, he'd find a healed relationship with the land. Job has other plans for the earth, however. First, Job identifies with the dust of the ground, from which he utters his protest. He says in Job 16:15, I have sewn sackcloth upon my skin and have laid my strength in the dust. He identifies fully and completely with the ground insofar as it manifests his own unjust death. Then, after describing his face's red clay grief, Job summons the earth to his side. O earth, do not cover my blood. Let my cry find no resting place. Job equates his blood with the outcry of protest. Blood spilled violently cries out. It's simply what it does when the ground gives it free rein. for the earth to cover the blood would conceal or accept the crime that God was surely committing against him in Job's reckoning. Having summoned the ground, Job appeals to his heavenly witness in the next verse. So you can see here, even now, in fact, my witness is in heaven. So he's got earth and heaven kind of summoned together as his witness. This legal summons, as Ken Brown notes, amounts for Job to the idea that God has violently attacked him, even though he's innocent. It's not just a cry for rescue, it's a demand for justice. To that end, Job solicits the help of heaven and earth to ensure that his cause continued beyond his own impending death. In other words, he had a protest going against God, and even if God killed him, the earth and the heavens themselves will cry out on his behalf. What better witnesses to keep his protest going for a very long time than the earth and heaven? In this way, his affiliation with the ground gives his outcry a permanence it wouldn't otherwise have. Zophar picks up on Job's appeals for these creational witnesses with some irony. As in chapter 16, Zophar affirms that God will indeed hunt him down with arrows, and Job had accused God of that. However, heaven and earth will not testify for him or come to his defense. Instead, they'll bear witness against him, vindicating God's relentless pursuit. So he says the heavens will instead reveal Job's iniquity, while the earth will rise up against him. For Zophar, heaven and earth would cry out like Abel's blood against Job, since he must be concealing some kind of iniquity and injustice. The land keeps the score and will find Job wanting. Job responds to such accusations in his final speech in chapter 31, his so-called oath of innocence. This is his last speech where he's got his fist in the air, declaring his innocence. Throughout that chapter, Job maintains his innocence against a litany of possible charges, claiming that he has not, in fact, covered over sin. In his closing argument, Job offers what looks like an attempt to distance himself from Cain's legacy. Let me just move that out of the way for you. That's Job 31. He maintains that he has not done anything that would make his land cry out against him or weep. He has not taken its yield, same word used in Genesis 4 to talk about the ground refusing to give its yield. Verse 39 uses a Hebrew term for breath that appears in Genesis 2:7, but to say that he hasn't breathed out or snuffed out or caused the land's owners to breathe their last. This verse draws a parallel between Job's alleged sin of unjustly eating the ground's yield and snuffing out the life of his workers. Unlike God, Job argues, he hasn't used his life breath to take life. Specifically, he hasn't withheld wages from his workers or indirectly caused their deaths, acts that would make the land cry out. In Job's thinking, injustice toward his land workers would provoke an outcry from the land itself. And as a statement of his innocence, Job invokes a curse upon himself should he be found guilty. Let thorns grow instead of wheat and foul weeds instead of barley. Job recognizes that a curse would envelop the land if he were to act unjustly against his workers. Norman Hobble writes, Job is asserting that where Adam failed, he, Job, has been faithful. Job is willing to experience the primordial curse of Adam anew if he, Job, has violated the fundamental relationship between himself and his ground of origin. The land would surely attest on his behalf and cry out to God with his own blood that God had spilled, is what Job envisions. Shifting gears now. In his book, The Songs of Trees, David George Haskell laments the double alienation from the natural world that characterizes much of modern life. We moderns have set humans against nature through pillaging of natural resources on the one hand, and through our romantic views of pristine nature that have little place for humans. Facing this alienation, Haskell yearns for a deeper ideal of living community, where humans belong in community with the land. Moving in an ethical direction, he wonders, Can we find an ethic full of earthly belonging, something less fractured than modernity offers? The answer depends, he concludes, on what kind of earth to which we think we belong. It's clear from Genesis and Job that the kind of earth to which we belong is morally interconnected. For both Genesis and Job, the land's capacity to respond to violence, whether Cain's or allegedly God's, reflects assumptions about the fundamentally moral nature of the human-land relationship. Actions done to or against another human involves the ground. It's not just the physical backdrop to the human drama. The land is a moral participant and thus able to exhibit moral responses toward or reflect the moral responses of humans. In their own ways, Genesis and Job affirm the correspondence between human morality and the conditions of the ground. For Genesis, the dust-eating serpent becomes the source of ongoing enmity, anticipating the possibility of a violent return to the dust. In Genesis 4, the land cries out on Abel's behalf and refuses to give its yield to Cain, driving him into exile away from the land itself. In a similar way, Job summons the land to cry out on his behalf. Then in his final plea, summons the earth to his side once more. Yet for Job's friends, the land would reveal his iniquity. They had sown into it, as it were. Genesis and Job also share the idea that humans come from the clay. For Genesis, this underscores our close kinship with plants, rivers, animals. Life springs from the soil, animated by God's breath, though it will also return there. Job lingers on that latter point, that humans are destined for the soil, when considering his own origins in the, quote, womb of the earth in Job 1:21. Job wishes he had never emerged. And having been born of the clay, he observes how clay lends itself to grief and death. Clay is made for smashing, so smashing is what God does. Job argues that the clay-like human is visibly suited to grief, and the breath of God blasts human away. Some scholars suggest that texts where the land acts as a moral agent reflect kind of ancient magical thinking, or the idea of the land as divine. Yet, as Mari Jorstad rightly points out, agency and the capacity for relationship don't necessitate the idea of divinity. The physical world is instead personalistic, not divinized or pantheistic. For Jorstad, personhood reflects a form of life, not a category that involves first and foremost. It involves first and foremost the capacity for relationships. The ground's ability to cry out on Abel's or Job's behalf reflects its relationship to humans. To be on the land among trees, plants, and animals is to be, as she puts it, among our relations. To these observations, we might also add that the physical world is shot through with moral fibers that entwine humans and their environments. Certainly, the early chapters of Genesis and the book of Job recognize the moral relationship that exists between the earth creature, the Adam, and the earth, Adamah. The land responds to human morality and even has the capacity to cover over or bear witness to wrongdoing. But both books also complicate the human-land moral nexus. For Genesis, the ground's cursed state is one that persists through time, impacting future generations in ways that aren't directly traceable to particular human occupants. In Job, God responds to the neat moral calculus of Job and his friends by reminding him of the human unaware regions of the world. Humans are one small part of the picture, and our ability to correlate precise cause and effect between human action in the land is greatly compromised. Nevertheless, the human-land moral bond is the presupposition of these texts. We may thus adapt John Muir's well-known phrase that when we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the moral universe. The moral is my addition there. The Hebrew Bible invites us to envision a natural world in which human-on-human action naturally involves the land. Of course it would, since we are from the land and will one day return there. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you, Matt, very much indeed. We do now have opportunity for comments and questions, either from those in this room or, of course, from those who are online. And maybe if those of you who are online could unmute yourselves to ask your questions, that we could all benefit from them. So are there questions or comments?
Turn my volume up because it would get played through here. Okay. Is there a question online?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
This is Felix Jurity. Sorry, David, I didn't mean to preempt you. I wondered, thank you for that very excellent and intriguing presentation. I wonder if I could get you to speculate a little bit with the current thesis going on behind Pope Francis's concept of integral ecology, and whether in fact this is completely allied or whether there is any tension there.
Could you help me out here, because I don't have his concept ready at hand, so I'll need you to spell that out.
In his encyclical Laudato Si,
yeah.
He argues about the synchrony, as you have just done in the Old Testament, between man, and you cannot separate the preservation and our seeing each other as fellow human beings from the way in which we see the land. So what I'm asking is if you believe that that is a powerful synergy between the two concepts.
Yeah, that's certainly, thanks for that question. And it's probably something I need to think about more, but certainly the idea of the inseparability of humans and the land is a major piece in a lot of biblical texts. And like I said, it's not even argued for, it's just assumed that, of course, the land is involved in how we treat each other. So that the Bible has a concept that not just do we impact the land by, say, direct acts of pollution or, in the ancient world, cutting down trees for warfare purposes, but that there's a more fundamental or basic connection between humans and the land that emerges in our creation, in the creation stories, comes out in the fall stories, and so on. I guess what I was also wanting to highlight is that the idea of our interconnection to the land is even more kind of provocative in the Bible, in that the land is portrayed as having agency in ways that are also assumed, and I don't think we can just chalk up to anthropomorphism.
Mm-hmm.
So one way of looking at these texts would be like, oh, the land is personified, but they didn't really think it had agency. And I would say, well, it's so pervasive. What makes you think they didn't think it had agency? And then people get nervous because they think, well, are you suggesting that the Bible envisions a land that's sort of divine, or traces of primal divinized ideas of the land? And I think your stat's helpful there, that it's personalistic, but not necessarily divinized. So I don't know if that's getting at your question.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Is it okay if I just ask?
Yeah.
Thanks very much, Matt. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about, so if the land keeps the score, my mind immediately goes to like atmospheric rivers hitting California, causing mayhem, moderate mayhem, compared to other places. But if the land keeps the score, do you see that as having some implications for what is traditionally been called natural evil? Like, the concept of natural evil, whereby which is a problem in, for some people.
Yeah.
In terms of thinking about God and God's relationship to the earth and relationship to us. If nature is allowed to exist, and not only to exist to produce storms, but to keep the score, and things get worse.
Yeah.
Doesn't that also have implications for how we think about nature, not just as good, but also as a source of evil?
Yeah, that's you're entering into the realm of like questions that this study prompts for me. So I've got like a whole kind of stack of questions where I'm like, okay, where do I go with this? Because this is not my conception of how the world works, but I'm trying to let the biblical text sort of push back on me. And yeah, I think, it's interesting how the idea of the world or the land as a source of evil might go a bit beyond what I'd want to press it to, but I do think there are instances in the Hebrew Bible, at least, where the land is, or the, let's call it the natural world, is portrayed as a culpable agent. So in Genesis 9, after the flood, God sets up this sort of post-flood arrangement and talks about how he's going to hold humans responsible for taking the blood of another, but also animals. That God, in this sort of fallen world, God is going to, in God's own justice, deal with the violence perpetrated by animals, which is very strange, right? And even before the flood, it says that violence had corrupted all creation, and that all that had life breath in it is held accountable. So I don't know necessarily where exactly to go with that. And this is where Job is a helpful conversation partner, in that Job says you can't just sort of pinpoint a one-for-one connection. You might recognize that this moral sort of fabric of the world is in some sense corrupted. But you can't pinpoint things with precision. So you can't say this atmospheric river in California is because of, whatever your favorite sin in California is, right? So Job says it's more complicated than that, lest you think you're so important, right? So that's kind of, I guess, one piece of it. Yeah, I see, David, you have a question, comment.
Thanks very much for your talk, Matthew. I do have one question here about the personality of the land, or you're giving it some, you're saying it has some kind of personal status, and did you say it has actual consciousness and moral consciousness, or how is it personal, or wouldn't it just be a consciousness kind of speaking through the land to the people rather than the land itself being a person? I'm just wondering how you would describe that.
Yeah, so I mean, I think partly Jorstad's idea is a provocation, and that I think is helpful to think with. She calls it personalistic. I'm not sure I'd want to just say the ground or the land has straightforward personhood with consciousness as we think of consciousness, but I'm trying to account in some way for the agency of creation as it's depicted in the biblical text, and I'd welcome other terminology to express that. And I think you can talk about the sort of personalistic or agential qualities of the land without sort of pushing that as far as saying, therefore, the land or the natural world has all the status and qualities that attend to humans, right? So that's not what I'm trying to push toward, but in some way to account for that moral agency, the culpability of the land, even in some places, and the land's interconnectedness with human morality. Now, I know there are interesting studies about, forests being so interconnected, they're kind of like a brain, and animals and so on. It's above my pay grade to get into the science of that. But yeah. Is that what do you think on that point? I don't know if I'm getting at your question.
Well, I would hesitate to grant personhood to the land.
Yeah.
I think that there is a person behind the land, and that's the creator of the land, and the land in some way would be expressing the in its agency would be expressing what its creator had intended for it without actually taking on a personal aspect itself. That's how I might think of it anyway. I really
yeah, sure, and I think like if we see the land or the physical world as just the animation of the creator's own agency, I think we'd have to at the same time account for the compatibility between the land's own agency and divine agency working together. And so like in the creation story, God says, let the land bring forth plants and animals. And then the land responds, and it does that. Yeah. And so, again, this is there are all kinds of important discussions we'd have to have about anthropomorphism and poetry and all of that, all those literary questions. But the land is not just a kind of tool where God expresses God's action in the world, but it's something that's invited to participate, and it responds, just like the trees of the field clap their hands and rejoice in response to divine action. Or in Leviticus, the land can negatively vomit people out and then take its Sabbaths because it's not gotten them while Israel's been on the land. So in varying ways, the land has, I don't want to say utterly independent agency, but it is described as acting in its own sort of sense.
Yeah, well, it's been created to act in a certain way.
Yeah.
And, I'd go back to
sure.
the terminology of primary and secondary causality. It's not the primary cause, it's a secondary cause. Like
that's helpful. Yeah, proximate and ultimate. Yeah.
That's all I can say. All I have to say.
No, that's good. Thank you.
I have a question.
Yeah.
My question is along the lines of moral boundaries that are created by the land. In a sense, Scott Beck talked about the idea of, your health is paying attention to reality at all costs.
Yeah.
So there is a sense that the land, for all of creation, creates a boundary, moral boundary. It can only be so bad, so to speak. So I just maybe the idea of boundaries.
Yeah, that's another category I don't really explore here, and I thought of it when I was working on this. That, like, as some people put it, like creation is made with an implied or built-in set of oughts to it, like what ought to be done, or and the very kind of limits of creation are not just physical limits, but moral limits too. I think of like the creation story in Genesis 2 is sort of a way of saying that you've got this good creation, but you can't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That's poison to you. And so you have like this physical world made with built-in limits that actually facilitate life there. So acknowledgement of those limits that are baked into creation are part of the way that God sets the moral context for human and non-human activity in the world. So yeah, I heartily agree with that and welcome that as one of the ways that there's as one scholar put it, there's an ethos to the cosmos, right? There's a built-in ethic to the world itself. Yeah, is that touching on what you're
that's very
getting at? Yeah. See, there's okay.
I have a question as well. The first part of your talk, where you framed your discussion in terms of what some of the more recent, but going back to the 19th century, ecological thinkers, environmental thinkers have to say. And the thought that occurred to me was that often the Judeo-Christian tradition is heavily criticized in that work because it is seen as having an ethic of mastery. And that ethic of mastery becomes a destructive ethic. And as a counter to that, one has heard a response that say, no, it's more of a stewardship. It seems to me that you're introducing here a very interesting additional possibility, which is to say, actually, if we look at what the scripture itself says, it's an ecological ethic that we find.
Very much so.
And this is really a different, and I think quite a substantial criticism of that mastery critique. Especially, of course, when you bring the added power of contemporary Aboriginal thought, which argues in the same direction. And so much academic, scholarly, and political thinking is now looking to Aboriginal ways of thinking about the environment. Well, is this what we in fact, is this where your line of thinking is taking?
Thanks. Very much so. I think, I agree. So the kind of Lynn White critique of the Christian creation story is that you've got humans who are put in the world to rule and subdue, and that's a violent ethic that puts us sort of as you put it, masters over creation. Now, I think, and Lynn White's been pretty thoroughly critiqued in his reading of Genesis 1 and 3, in that humans are given authority to rule and to subdue, but that in context, you're doing it as an image bearer of a God who obviously loves and wants this creation to flourish, and that rule involves stewardship and so on. But I think you're right that what I'm trying to emphasize is that it's not just that we're put over in a paternalistic way to care for creation, but that we're also bound up with creation itself in a way that's resonant with some of these, some of the kind of indigenous conceptions of a mutual reciprocity between humans and the land. And I know a lot of Christians get sort of panicky and anxious when they might hear that, because they would think, well, you're devaluing humans in the process. And I don't think that's the case at all. But I think it's reflecting what the Bible itself sees as a sort of two-way relationship of responsibility between humans and the land. So when Israel is given a land, if you don't give the land its Sabbaths, it's going to take them. And if that means vomiting you out, then so be it. And so then you're suddenly in this kind of ethical world where you have a kind of two-way relationship of mutuality. And it's interesting, and I read a collection of essays recently on traditional ecological knowledge with a lot of indigenous writers, and that theme of reciprocity is absolutely central in those discussions. And I think that's a really helpful way, as I put it at the beginning, of avoiding the two forms of alienation. One is kind of mastery over and use it for our purposes, and the other is this ideal of pristine, untouched nature, where humans have no place in it. So, yeah.
At the same time, one can't, at least it seems to me, you can't go too far down that avenue, or you do indeed get to a kind of pantheism.
Yeah, and that's where I found Yerstad's work helpful, that agency does not mean divinity. And any more than, the idea that your dog can act as an agent means it's somehow divine. Oddly, like some people get nervous when the land is spoken of in those terms. So yeah, I've been thinking about like different ways of conceptualizing this. So I thought about like one system as the land as a sort of moral backdrop or an object of human ethical action. So we care for it, or it's just the stage. Another is kind of like moral continuity, where our behavior is consonant with nature as providing those natural boundaries. So that's kind of along the lines of what you were saying, Gord. And then also this third idea of, I'm thinking of language for it, but more like a moral matrix that highlights the moral ecology within which moral obligations exist mutually. So yeah. Yeah.
Just one more question. In Genesis 1, you get a picture of harmony, or you use the term reciprocity.
Yeah.
But there is a sense of harmony between man and woman, between humans and nature, and humans and God. And then the brokenness of fall, which creates that, or it creates this alienation.
Yeah.
Yeah, so harmony creates a nice moral environment, a moral ecology as well.
Yeah.
So we all get along. Can't we all just get along?
Yeah. It's so then part of my thinking is, well, how do we account for the fallenness of the world? Because so Genesis 3 doesn't, and following, do not pick the picture of just humans in this idealistic relationship with the physical world. We're in many ways at odds with each other, but the possibility of cultivation still exists. And at times it devolves into outright hostility, as in the case of Cain, where the ground just says no more, you're going to become a nomad. So I think our kind of moral imagination for thinking about the physical world has to include accounting for the strained relationship, and therefore our healing and the land's healing involves the kind of reintegration of those relationships. Yeah.
And the possibility of moral growth, right?
Yeah.
That we can move towards better relationships.
Yeah, absolutely.
Even though there's tension.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Are there any more questions? Any more from the people online? Okay, we'll draw things to a close. Matt, thank you so much. What a fascinating presentation. I mean, I was not expecting to get into the ecological and Aboriginal literature. It's just a superb piece of interdisciplinary integration, and just really fascinating. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for that.